Hi everyone, this is Yana Smakula for SimonsStamp.com and thank you for joining me today. What I love my stamps most for is the ability to stamp patterns for my project, combine different images and different colors, and make these stamped impressions appear like patterned paper. You might think that stamping patterns is something very difficult to do or very time-consuming, but in fact it's not. When I go to stamp a background pattern for my card, it doesn't necessarily take me longer to create that particular project over a project with, say, some simple stamping. There are a lot of different ways to stamp patterns for your projects depending on the images you're using. I'll show you one of those ways in this video. I'll be stamping a floral pattern using Simon Says Stamp Wild Beauty stamp set, various ink colors, and Copic markers. You can use other stamps for this technique. I'll just share a few basic tips or rules that I use when I go to create patterns for my projects. I usually like to use color layering stamp sets for stamping floral patterns. Color layering uses the technique of stamping images progressively, adding color and detail for a beautiful look. This stamp set that I have here has two layers to each image. There is an outline layer that adds detail and a base layer for adding color. But other color layering sets where there's 3 or even 4 layers to each image also work beautifully for stamping patterns. And again, they don't necessarily take a lot longer to stamp. Before I go to stamping a floral pattern, I decide if I want to do masking or if I don't want to do any masking. And I just want to stamp images next to each other without any overlap. Masking takes a little bit of extra time, but it does give you that beautiful clustered look. If I decide to do masking, and I am going to do masking to stamp my patterns today, I then decide on a cluster that I want to create and identify the images that will need masks for my project. Here I have a test pattern that I did using several different images from the Wild Beauty stamp set. I selected my main image, that is that largest yellow flower, my additional flowers, I have them colored in green and gray, and also my foliage. I have several different leaves and leafy branches here. And I tried a couple of different combinations. I clustered images differently and I mixed in different images just to see what that would look like. So for me, this is the first step. Decide if I want to or don't want to do masking, decide on the cluster of images, and test stamp a few ideas out. Here's a pattern stamped using identical images with 2 different flowers being masked. I also have some images floating free in the background. A few flowers are not attached to anything. They're just there to fill in the space in between the floral clusters. Here's another card that I shared on my blog a while ago. Absolutely no masking was used to create this floral pattern here. Yet it still looks beautiful. So after I've decided on the images that I want to use and clusters I want to create, I then go to pick my colors. Again, I would test stamp a few images on a scrap piece of paper and use several different color combinations to see if I like any of them. Here's a close-up of my test image. I used various colors of ink and a few colors of Copic markers to color these flowers. So now that I know what kind of pattern I want to stamp and what images will require a mask, I will go ahead and stamp and cut the mask out for my project. I will only need a mask for one image, the largest flower, and I'm going to make 2 identical masks for this card. When I go to coloring my images with the second stamp layer and ink, I will need to replace the first mask, the old one, with a fresh one to avoid getting ink transfer onto my paper, and I'll explain that in detail when I get to that point. So I'm stamping my masks onto post-it notes and I'm cutting one of them with my scissors. You can also use masking paper for this or regular printer paper and just adhere it with temporary adhesive or even hold it in place with your finger or use a piece of washi tape to hold it down when you do your stamping. So now it's time to start stamping the pattern. I usually like to start in the center of my panel, and this particular panel is cut to 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. I'm using Simon's Intense Black ink because it's a Copic-friendly ink, and I will be using Copic markers to color the images that don't have matching layers to add color to them. So I've stamped the first image, the main flower. I masked it with my post-it note mask, and I'm adding additional images and creating my cluster. For this particular pattern, I'm going to use a static set of images, so flowers and leaves are going to be identical in all of my clusters, but you can mix them up if you like. The trick to stamping a pattern like this fast is to have your images mounted onto clear blocks. This way, you're not constantly changing up the stamps on your clear blocks, and you're not spending a lot of time not stamping. You do need a couple of clear blocks for this though. And you can use the front and back of your blocks like I'm doing here. I also like to work in clusters. So I first go to stamp one cluster. After it's done, I go to stamp the next cluster and then the next one. Each previous cluster, however, influences the next one. My clusters, even though they are using the same images, are not identical. I do rotate my images to make sure I do not have any huge gaps on my background. And I also cluster them a bit differently. So I would change up the order in which the images are stamped, not changing the images themselves, just the order and the direction which they're facing. I also try to follow the rule of a triangle and create visual triangles on my project. I don't want this particular pattern to look geometric, so I'm trying not to stamp the flowers on a straight line, but rather forming triangles on the background. If I use geometric shapes, say a circle or a triangle or a square, I do try to stay in a straight line, but here, this is more of an organic pattern, so I'm staying away from straight lines. You'll notice that I can't fit a flower everywhere on the background, like there on the left-hand side, but I can fit the leaves. So this is what I'm doing. I'm going outside the edge so that it appears that this pattern was cut out from a larger pattern, and it appears that the pattern continues beyond this sheet of paper, and it looks like the flower is there overlapping the leaves, although it's not. Now you will usually end up having spaces in between your floral clusters, and you can keep those spaces empty, or you can use small images to fill in those spaces. I like to use whatever small images I can find and just stamp them in between my clusters to add additional interest to my patterns. Here I'm using the flower centers and just stamping them in black, filling in the gaps in between my flowers. But again, this is optional and floral patterns do look beautiful without these fillers. After I've stamped my pattern, I go to color it. Again, to make things go faster, I color one type of image at a time. So I don't do each cluster from start to finish, but rather work in stages. So stage 1 would be to stamp the cluster, stage 2 would be to color the biggest flower in each cluster, then stage 3 would be to mask the largest flower and color the smaller flower again in each cluster, and so on. If I were to color each cluster from start to finish, it would take more time, and there would be a bigger chance of messing up, at least for me. I tend to lose focus and ink up my stamps with the wrong color of ink and just mess this whole thing up. So for me, it is more productive and more efficient to do one color at a time. Now, if this flower had 3 or 4 layers, I would first stamp that second layer using one color of ink, then stamp third layer using another color of ink, and then stamp fourth layer on all flowers using that last color of ink. It does take less time for me if I work this way. So after I colored the largest flower and I used Simon Says Stamp Sunshine ink, I then started working on the blue flower. Again, I would mask the main image and stamp the second flower in another color, and I'm using Simon Says Stamp High Dive for this one. Now this is where you will need to have a new clean mask. A mask will protect your image only so many times. After you've saturated your masking paper with ink a couple of times, that ink will transfer onto the image that it is masking, just like it did here on the bottom flower. So that means it's time to use a new mask to avoid getting that ink transfer further. I'm going to go ahead and cut out that second mask that I had previously stamped and continue coloring my images. I did forget to color one of the blue flowers in the center, but I will come back to it later. Now, not all images in this particular stamp set have matching layers, but it doesn't mean I can't color them using other ways. I'm going to use Copic markers and add color to those other black and white images. Now, I'm not going to do any ink blending. The main flowers were stamped in one color of ink. There's no going from light to dark. So to maintain that look, I'm not going to do any double or triple color blending on the rest of these. I'm using BG13 to color the largest leaf, and again, like I did with the stamping, I'm first using one color and coloring one type of image at a time. It does take longer to color versus to stamp and color, but I don't mind. Plus, I can introduce another colors to my pattern. And if you wanted to, you could actually Copic color this entire piece, or watercolor it, or color it with your colored pencils. To color the second leafy branch, I'm using V12 color. I wanted to add a bit of lilac to this background. So again, I'm using one color and coloring one type of image only. Next, I'm using V17 to color the small round flower, and I also used a yellow marker to finish coloring this pattern. So here's the look of the two patterns that I made using this stamp set. It took me about 20 minutes to stamp and color each pattern. So 20 minutes for one pattern. Now to turn this into a card, I like to keep it simple. The pattern is very busy already, so I wouldn't add anything too distracting or too detailed. For example, I wouldn't add a detailed word die cut on top of this, as it would just get lost. So I'm going to add panels with heat embossed sentiments. Alternatively, you can add a layer of vellum to mute a part of this pattern, and I often like to do that. But for these, I will heat emboss the sentiment in white embossing powder and will just foam mount it onto the background. So first, I'm going to prep my panel with an anti-static powder tool. This tool does wonders for heat embossing. There are a couple of different tools like this one, and they all work great. So what this tool does is it eliminates the static on the paper and also eliminates the grease and oils from your fingers and just helps to keep embossing clean. I never do my heat embossing without this or a similar tool. I'm going to go ahead and stamp the sentiment, and I'm making sure to align it on my panel so that it is centered. I'm referring to the grid lines on my cutting mat and also on my clear block. Next, going to cover the stamped image with embossing powder. I'm using Hero Arts white embossing powder today and heat set the powder to melt it. Before I heat set it, I often like to use a dry paintbrush to clean up any stray embossing powder particles that might have ended up sticking to the paper where they are not needed, but I didn't have any on this particular piece. I've already adhered my stamped panel onto an A2 top folding card base. I trimmed this card slightly, so it's not really an A2, just a little smaller, and I'm going to foam mount the sentiment panel on top. When I'm using foam adhesive, I like to use a lot of it. If I'm not adding a solid layer of foam, I do like to test if I have enough support. So I would add foam adhesive squares, I would flip the paper, and press with my fingers to feel if it's sturdy enough. If it's not, I then just go back and add more foam adhesive from the back. Lastly, I added a few clear sequins and clear drops just to add some sparkle and shine to these projects. So here's a closer look at these cards featuring stamped floral patterns. I hope I've given you some inspiration and some good tips, and you will try stamping patterns like this yourself. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'll see you next time. Bye!